Is this some kind of joke? The words, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the humid afternoon air. Officer Brandy Wallace planted her hands on her hips, her mirrored sunglasses reflecting a distorted, wide-angle image of the man sitting before her on the motorcycle. "Sir, I asked you a question. Do you even know where you are?" Arthur Corrigan, 82 years young, did not answer immediately. His hands, gnarled with age but steady as granite, rested on the handlebars of his vintage Harley-Davidson. The chrome, polished to a mirror shine, gleamed under the oppressive sun. He wore a simple leather vest over a faded plaid shirt, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on some distant point down the long black ribbon of highway. He seemed less a man being pulled over and more a monument waiting for the world to catch up. "License and registration," Wallace's partner, Officer Miller, said, his tone a bit more weary, less theatrical. He was younger than Wallace, but already seemed to have less patience for the drama she courted. Wallace stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel of the shoulder. "And get off the damn bike." Now, her voice was a whip crack, a deliberate assertion of authority aimed at a man who seemed utterly unimpressed by it. She let her hand drift down, coming to rest on the butt of her holstered Glock. It was a practiced, almost subconscious gesture of intimidation. She saw an old man on an old bike, a relic clogging up the fast lane, a public nuisance. What she failed to see was the stillness in his eyes, the absolute lack of fear that comes only to those who have faced down horrors she couldn't possibly imagine. The confrontation had begun, but for Arthur Corrigan, it was just another Tuesday. The real storm was still miles away, but it was coming, fast. The heat shimmer rising from the asphalt created a wavering, dreamlike quality to the scene. Cars slowed as they passed, rubbernecking drivers trying to piece together the roadside drama. On the overpass a quarter-mile back, a small cluster of onlookers had begun to form. Officer Wallace was building a narrative in her head, one she was already mentally composing for her report. Elderly driver, erratic lane changes which hadn't actually happened, operating a powerful machine he was clearly unfit to handle. It was a simple, clean story. Arthur's stoic silence was, to her, an admission of guilt, or perhaps senility. "Sir, I am not going to ask you again," Wallace said, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "Step off the motorcycle, now, or I will remove you from it myself." Arthur's eyes finally moved, shifting from the horizon to meet her mirrored gaze. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and held a depth that seemed to swallow the light. Slowly, with a deliberateness that was more infuriating to Wallace than any outright defiance, he swung a leg over the seat and stood. He wasn't a large man, but he stood with a rootedness, a sense of occupying his space that made him seem to tower over the two officers. He reached into the back pocket of his worn jeans and pulled out a battered leather wallet, its seams held together by little more than memory. He handed his driver's license to Officer Miller, who took it with a clipped "thank you." Wallace, however, wasn't looking at the license. Her eyes were fixed on Arthur's vest, specifically, a faded hand-stitched patch on the left breast. It was a dark, abstract shape, the threads frayed, its colors long since bleached by decades of sun and rain. To her it looked like some crude skull, the kind of amateurish insignia a local motorcycle gang might adopt. "What's this supposed to be?" she sneered, pointing a gloved finger at the patch, her nail nearly touching it. "Part of some little club, are we? Riding with your buddies, causing trouble?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy as the exhaust fumes from a passing truck. Arthur's expression didn't change, but a new stillness fell over him, an intensity that hadn't been there before. He looked down at the patch on his own chest as if seeing it for the first time in years. "It's a reminder," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "A reminder of what?" Wallace pressed, her tone mocking. "That you're a tough guy? A rebel?" The world seemed to drop away. The roar of the highway traffic faded into a dull, rhythmic thumping, a sound that wasn't of cars but of helicopter blades beating against thick, humid air. The leather vest became a sweat-soaked flak jacket. The oppressive sun of the roadside became the sweltering, suffocating heat of a jungle canopy. Arthur wasn't 82 anymore. He was 22, his face lean and taut, caked with dirt and grime. He was inside a Huey, the door gunner laying down suppressive fire as the chopper descended into a landing zone alight with chaos. All around him were young men, boys really, their eyes wide with a terror that was ancient and holy. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned. It was his platoon sergeant, a man named Riggs, pointing to the same patch on his own uniform. "Don't you ever forget what this means, Corrigan," Riggs had shouted over the cacophony of battle. "It means we go where others won't. It means we don't leave anyone behind, ever." The smell of cordite, jet fuel, and wet earth filled his senses, A memory not recalled but relived. A ghost of a sensation, a flash echo from a lifetime away. He came back to himself in an instant. He was back on the shoulder of Route 7, the smell of asphalt and exhaust filling his nose again. Officer Wallace was still staring at him, her lips curled in a smirk, waiting for an answer he could never give her. "It's just an old patch, officer," he said softly. The small crowd on the overpass had grown. Among them was a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, a college student majoring in history. She spent her weekends volunteering at the Fort Calloway Military Museum, cataloging artifacts and archiving oral histories. She wasn't an expert, but she had seen enough to recognize the quiet, unyielding dignity of the old soldiers who sometimes came to visit. She saw it now in the man by the Harley. She also saw Officer Wallace's escalating aggression, the way she postured and prodded, trying to provoke a reaction. It was a scene Sarah had heard described in the oral histories, the quiet heroes returning home only to be misunderstood, their sacrifices invisible to the civilian world. Then her eyes caught the patch. It was faded, almost unrecognizable, but she had seen the design before, under pristine glass in a museum display case. It was the death's head of the 1st Cavalry Division's air assault units from Vietnam. It wasn't a gang patch, it was a badge of unbelievable honor, worn by men who flew into the hottest landing zones in history. A cold knot of anger and urgency formed in her stomach. This wasn't just a traffic stop, it was a desecration. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She didn't press record. Recording felt passive, like being a spectator to an execution. She needed to intervene. She scrolled through her contacts to a number she'd been given by the museum curator, a number for emergencies only. It was the direct line to the aid of the base's commanding officer. Her call was answered on the second ring. Captain Evans. The voice was crisp, professional. "Captain, my name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a volunteer at the museum," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm on Route 7, just outside the main gate. The local police have pulled over an elderly man on a motorcycle. They're harassing him. I think he's one of yours." "What makes you say that, miss?" "Jenkins?" the captain asked, his tone shifting from administrative to alert. "He's wearing a 1st Cav patch, an old one, Vietnam-era air assault. And the way he's standing, the way he's taking it, he's a soldier." "I know he is," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "The officer is about to arrest him. Please, you have to do something. His name," the officer just read it from his license. "His name is Arthur Corrigan." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a silence so profound Sarah thought the call had been dropped. The quiet lasted only a second, but in that second, the entire world shifted. "Miss Jenkins," Captain Evans said, his voice now tight with an electrifying urgency she couldn't comprehend. "Where exactly are you? Stay on the line. Do not hang up. Help is on the way." Inside the sprawling headquarters of Fort Calloway, Captain Evans stood ramrod straight, his face pale. He held his phone away from his ear as if it were radioactive. The name Arthur Corrigan echoed in the sterile quiet of his office, a name that carried the weight of history. It wasn't a name you read in a field manual. It was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and reverence, a name that belonged to the realm of myth. He didn't knock. He burst into the inner office of his commanding officer, General Marcus Thompson, a man known for his icy calm and strategic brilliance. Thompson looked up from a mountain of paperwork, his brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. "Evans, what is it? Is the base on fire?" "Sir," Evans said, breathing heavily. "We just received a call from a civilian. Local PD has a man pulled over on Route 7. They're threatening him with arrest." Thompson sighed, annoyed. "This is a matter for the MPs and local liaison, Captain. Why are you bringing it to me?" "Sir," Evans said, taking a steadying breath, "the man they've pulled over. It's Sergeant Major Arthur Corrigan." The name landed in the room like a physical blow. General Thompson's entire demeanor changed in a heartbeat. The administrative annoyance vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He rose from his chair, a formidable 2-star general suddenly looking like a subordinate who had just been summoned by his own commander. "Corrigan." Thompson's voice was a low growl. "Arthur Corrigan. Our Arthur Corrigan." "Yes, sir. On a motorcycle. They're treating him like a common criminal." Thompson's face was a mask of thunder. "Get the command vehicle," he ordered, his voice dangerously quiet, "and get me an honor detail from the old guard. Dress blues. Now, Captain, move." The audience, through this brief glimpse behind the curtain, now knew what the officers on the roadside did not. They were not hassling a forgotten old man. They were standing on hallowed ground. Back on the sun-scorched highway shoulder, Officer Wallace's patience had finally evaporated. Arthur's quiet dignity felt like a personal insult, his silence a judgment on her authority. The growing crowd on the overpass only fueled her frustration, making her feel exposed and challenged. She had to end this, and she had to win. "That's it," she announced, her voice ringing with a final, unappealable verdict. "I've had enough of your games, old man. You're clearly a danger to yourself and everyone else on this road. We're impounding the bike and you're coming with us for a full psychiatric and medical evaluation." She turned to her partner, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Miller, cuff him." Miller hesitated, his eyes darting from his partner's enraged face to Arthur's serene one. This felt wrong, deeply wrong, but a direct order was a direct order. He unclipped the cold steel of the handcuffs from his belt and took a reluctant step forward. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply watched the younger officer approach, his pale blue eyes holding not fear, but a profound, unshakable sadness. It was in that moment, as the first cuff was about to be placed on Arthur's wrist, that the sound began. It wasn't the familiar wail of a police siren. It was a deeper, more powerful rumble, a low, synchronized growl of heavy-duty engines that seemed to make the very asphalt vibrate. Heads turned. Coming down the exit ramp from the highway was not a squad car, but a procession that belonged in a military parade or a dignitary's motorcade. Two gleaming black Chevrolet Suburbans with government plates led the way, their emergency lights flashing in a silent, disciplined rhythm. Behind them were two large military transport vans, the kind used to move troops. The convoy didn't slow. It pulled onto the wide shoulder with practiced, intimidating precision, forming a perfect semicircular cordon around the scene, effectively cutting off the two police officers from the rest of the world. Doors opened in unison. From the vans, a dozen soldiers disembarked. They were members of the old guard, immaculate in their dress blue uniforms, their movements sharp, economical, and utterly synchronized. They formed two perfect ranks, their collective gaze fixed forward, creating an impenetrable wall of military formality. From the lead Suburban, the rear door opened. General Marcus Thompson emerged, his two stars glittering on his collar. He was tall, imposing, his face set like flint. He strode past the honor guard, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, his eyes locked on one man and one man only, Arthur Corrigan. He completely ignored Officer Wallace and Officer Miller, as if they were nothing more than inconveniently placed lawn furniture. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Arthur. He drew himself up to his full height, his back rigid. Then he executed the sharpest, most profound salute Officer Wallace had ever witnessed. It was not a gesture of mere protocol. It was an act of pure, unadulterated reverence. "Sergeant Major Corrigan." General Thompson's voice boomed across the suddenly silent roadside. "General Thompson, it is an honor to see you again, sir." Arthur slowly raised a hand and gave a tired, informal salute back. "Marcus," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Making a scene, as usual." General Thompson dropped his salute but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the two stunned officers and the gawking crowd. His voice took on a formal, declamatory tone, as if he were reading a citation at a White House ceremony. "For the education of those present," he began, his voice cold and clear, "this man who you have detained and humiliated is retired Sergeant Major Arthur Corrigan. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1959. He is a veteran of 3 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. He is a recipient of the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars for Valor, and 4 Purple Hearts." The general took a breath, his eyes boring into Wallace's. "He is also the recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions on Hill 875 in the Battle of Dak II, where as a young sergeant, he single-handedly defended a wounded platoon against overwhelming odds for 6 hours, allowing for their safe evacuation. He refused evacuation himself until every one of his men was airborne." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Officer Miller's face was ashen. Officer Wallace's jaw had fallen slack, her swagger and bravado completely stripped away, leaving only raw, naked shock. Her mirrored sunglasses couldn't hide the horror dawning in her eyes. The tough guy biker patch she had mocked was the emblem of a unit of legends, worn by a man who was a legend himself. "This man," General Thompson continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "has been awarded more honors for bravery than most soldiers see in a lifetime. He has advised 4-star generals and 3 presidents. He doesn't ride with a club. He rides with the ghosts of the finest men this nation has ever produced. The patch you mocked on his vest is his right to bear, a right he re-earned in blood a dozen times over." He finally turned his full attention to Officer Wallace, his eyes like chips of ice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet fury was more terrifying than any shout. "Officer, your ignorance today has dishonored a man to whom this entire nation owes a debt it can never repay. You have two choices. You can remove those cuffs, return the Sergeant Major's license, and offer him the most profound apology you can summon. Or you and I and your chief of police can have a conversation with the national press and the Pentagon about why your department feels it's appropriate to abuse a national hero. Your decision. Make it now." Wallace stood frozen, utterly broken. The world had inverted. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. Before she could stammer out a response, Arthur's calm voice cut through the tension. "General," he said, placing a gentle hand on Thompson's arm. "It's all right. Stand down your men." He turned his pale blue eyes to Officer Wallace, and for the first time she saw no anger in them, only a weary empathy. "Dignity, officer," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a sermon. "It's the one thing you should always give freely to others, because it's the one thing no one can ever take from you. Remember that." As he spoke of dignity, the world flickered again. He wasn't on the roadside. He was in a field hospital, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. A young private no older than 18 lay on a cot, his leg bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. The boy was crying not from pain but from the shame of having to be carried off the battlefield. He unpinned the first cav patch from his own uniform and pressed it into Arthur's hand. "You take it, Sarge," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "You stayed. You earned it more than me." It wasn't a military decoration, it was a gift, a transfer of honor from one soldier to another, in a moment of ultimate vulnerability. The origin of the patch wasn't about being tough, it was about being worthy of another man's sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift but quiet. There were no news stories, no public spectacle. General Thompson had made it clear that Sergeant Major Corrigan wanted no such thing. Instead, a formal letter of apology signed by the chief of police was delivered to Arthur's small, neat home. More significantly, the Fort Calloway command staff was invited to help the local police department design and implement a new mandatory training program focused on veteran de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Officer Wallace and Officer Miller were the first two names on the roster. About a month later, Officer Brandy Wallace, off duty and in jeans and a t-shirt, walked into a small local diner for a late breakfast. The place was nearly empty save for a few regulars. As she sat at the counter, she saw him. Arthur Corrigan was sitting in a booth by the window, alone, slowly sipping a cup of coffee and looking out at the street. Her heart hammered in her chest. Every instinct told her to turn and walk out, to avoid the shame, the memory of her own arrogance. But the Sergeant Major's words on the roadside echoed in her head. "Dignity. It's the one thing you should always give freely." She took a deep breath. She walked up to the counter, paid for her own meal, and then turned to the waitress. "And I'll take his check too," she said, nodding subtly towards Arthur's booth. The waitress nodded, understanding. Wallace didn't wait for thanks. She didn't try to approach him or force a conversation. That would have been for her, not for him. Instead, as she walked towards the exit, she caught his eye. He looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. She gave a short, simple nod. It was an acknowledgement, an apology, and a sign of respect, all wrapped into one silent gesture. To her surprise, Arthur Corrigan slowly, deliberately nodded back, a silent acceptance, a quiet closing of the circle. No words were needed. The lesson had been learned. A small measure of dignity had been freely given, and in doing so, a small measure of her own had been restored. The story of Arthur Corrigan is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear their greatness on their sleeves. They are quiet, unassuming figures living among us, carrying the weight of a history we can only imagine. Their valor is not a performance. It's a part of who they are. If you believe in honoring these unassuming heroes and sharing their incredible stories, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more.